Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I've received a donation of $20 for videos on the Byzantine Empire and Seljuk Turks. I didn't know much about either one. The Byzantine Empire I know something about because they're so heavily influenced by the Greeks and the Romans, but the Greeks, a very large part. So I knew a little bit about that, but the Seljuk Turks I had no idea. So I have two sources for this. We're going to go first to the history of the later Roman Empire, from the death of Theodosius to the death of Justinian by J.B. Bury, B-U-R-Y. And we've got some information about the Byzantine Empire, basically. Now I have to start off by saying that one reason I haven't studied this period and the events of this period is because I started to study it and did quite a large outline of material for a video series on the Crusades. And I didn't know what the Crusades was all about. I didn't know if it was Christianized Europe defending itself against bloodthirsty Muslims, or bloodthirsty Christians just going on rampage, or what. And after doing a pretty thorough study, reading quite a bit, I concluded that the Crusades were just an unprincipled sort of a scatter for money. They're just going for loot. They were motivated by religion, and that's never a good motive. The Crusades were the actions of a people that had lost the ability to think. They were not philosophers. They weren't philosophical. They were very crude and unprincipled. That's what I really came to the conclusion of, was unprincipled warfare, just constant fighting and bickering. I was unimpressed by it, and I've never even done the video series, even though I spent quite a lot of time outlining material, and I put video number 1 up. Video number 2 is still on my hard drive. So I have to start off by saying this whole period of history is much less interesting and much less important than the ones that come before and after it. However, if you're going to study the Dark Ages, say from 600 to 1200 AD, then the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic civilization in the Middle East is probably what you should study. To study Charlemagne or anything that happened in Western Europe is to waste a bit of your time unless you really enjoy studying that stuff, because it's just not very instructive for human life. You can learn so much from the Greeks, a little bit from the Romans. You can learn tons about living your life today and how you should act today from the Renaissance and Galileo and Newton, but you cannot learn much from a bunch of medieval thugs running around praying. You just can't. That said, let's embark on the best information I can gather on the subject. And this is from sources I have available to me now. Most of my books are in Utah, and it would be better if I had those, but I don't. We're going to start on page 63 about the establishing the extreme religiousness of the later Byzantium system, because it inherited, as I probably don't even need to mention this part, but the Byzantine Empire inherited Roman civil law. It was an offshoot of the Roman Empire. It became its own empire when the East and the West split, when the two leaders of each side, the two emperors of each side, excommunicated each other. So, while in all ancient monarchies, religion and sacerdotalism were a political as well as a social power, the position of the Christian Church in the Roman Empire was a new thing in the world, presenting a problem of a kind with which no ruler had hitherto been confronted, and to which no past experience offered a key. So the author says that the experience with Christianity was new, even though human history is replete with religion being involved in society and being in control, and religion being the basis of monarchy and so on. Even though history's full of that, still the Christian Church offered something new. The history of the empire would have been profoundly different if the church had remained as independent of the state as it had before Constantine, and if that emperor and his successors had been content to grant to the church the same freedom and privileges which were enjoyed by pagan cults and priesthoods. Interesting point there, isn't it? He says that if they would have just let the Christian church alone and given it the freedom that they gave to pagan cults, then it would have been a profoundly different history. But because they chose to try to constrain and control and choke the church and make it go this way instead of that, because of that, they ended up, if you will, taking the lion by the ears, or the wolf or the bear by the ears. And you've got it now, and you're really screwed, and you should have just ran or went up a tree or whatever. Okay, so it would have been very different, but instead they decided to try to control the church. But heresies and schisms and religious intolerance on one side, and the despotic instinct to control all social forces on the other, brought about a close union between the state and the church, which altered the character and spirit of the state and constituted the most striking difference between the early and the late Roman Empire. So the religiousness of the empire is what's really an important thing to realize. That came into being later and was not the case earlier. And that they did not, as the author is pointing out, they did not, the Catholics, the Romans, did not fall under despotism of paganism. They didn't fall under a dictatorship of Zeus. First of all, pagan philosophy and religion weren't equipped with the material needed to do that sort of thing. And second of all, they didn't try to put the state controls on it. This is a lesson for people who want to put state controls on Islam, as they're doing in Europe. They want to make sure that the government builds the mosques and pays for the imams and approves what's taught in them and so on. Now, you can't have people in mosques preaching violence, but beyond that, you can't do much about it. And France shows that, shows what's happening. Same thing happened in Rome. You are scared of this religion, it's too popular, it's too powerful, so you set up state controls to try to take control of it. And what happens is the religious people who are interested in the subject infiltrate your mechanisms of control. They take them over, and it can take decades for it to happen, but there's no one else trying to get control of those organs of state power. It's only the people that are interested in it, i.e. the religious people. So, out of ideological motivation, they try to control the religion and end up getting bit in the butt by it at the end. Okay, the next page we have a quote. Historical circumstances decided that the league of church and state should develop on a very different line in the East and the West. In the West, it was to result in the independence and ultimately the supremacy of the church. Okay, that's different from the East. Quote, in the East, the church was kept in subordination to the head of the state. And finally, ecclesiastical affairs seem little more than a departure of the imperial government. Even in the 4th century, the Bishop of Rome has a more independent position than the Bishop at Constantinople. That remains sort of the way of life and the philosophy of the East today. Clear today, we are 1,500 years later, and look, for example, in Russia or anywhere in the Middle East, you're going to find that the church is subordinate to the state. Whereas in the West, that inherited more of the Roman and less of the, if we can say, the barbaric and the Islamic and the Middle Eastern ideas. I know Islam came after, but if we can make that distinction, then the West, the Roman Empire proper, where Rome itself was, that area didn't inherit the supremacy of the state. They actually inherited the supremacy of the church, and later on, the church was taken away from the state to protect it from state incursion. So, the Dark Ages in the West was a rule by the church. The Dark Ages